before we start then the wisdom side of things, look at Proverbs 8. And from verse 22 onwards, you have this passage that's devoted to wisdom. And wisdom is depicted here as a person. And wisdom speaks as a person. And wisdom talks about the relationship wisdom had with God in the beginning, and how wisdom was present at creation, and the role of wisdom in creation. And it's an insight into the eternal relationship between God and his Son. So just as a flavor of this then, turn to Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 22. The Lord possessed me, so this is wisdom speaking. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. Where there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. When he established the clouds above. When he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he assigned, I've lost my place now. When he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters would not transgress his command. There I was beside him, and so on, a master craftsman. So can you see how in Proverbs 8, this vision, this depiction of wisdom is a representation of the eternal relationship between God the Father and God the Son. So, as I say, if you want to think further about these visions of Jesus Christ that we have set before us, that's a passage you can turn to and look at to enrich those visions. Okay, then, so let's think now about the well-being wisdom that we find in the book of Proverbs. And there's a couple of verses I want us to notice, and we're going to settle on one of them and explore that verse this evening. So turn to Proverbs then, and these are the verses I want to draw your attention to. So if we turn first of all to Proverbs 12, and the verse there that I would like to be the main focus really for this evening is verse 25. So Proverbs 12 and verse 25. Anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. So that's the verse that we'll focus on. But this verse is typical of a number of similar verses. So turn across to chapter 14 and you'll find similar verses there. So this is Proverbs 14. And first of all, take a look at verse 10. Proverbs 14 and verse 10. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. Okay, so just clock that verse, if you will, and then go down into chapter 14 and verse 30. So Proverbs 14 and verse 30. A sound heart is life to the body, but envy is rottenness to the bones. Okay, so we are just noting a series of verses in Proverbs that has a similar kind of feel to it, and then we're going to settle on one. So let's build the picture then in Proverbs 15 and verse 13 to begin with. Proverbs 15 and verse 13. A merry heart makes a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of the heart, the spirit is broken. Okay, so note that verse, and then note verse 15. All the days of the afflicted are evil, but he who is of a merry heart has a continual feast. Okay, a few more verses then. Go across to chapter 17, and this time we'll take a look at verse 22. So Proverbs 17 and verse 22. A merry heart does good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. Okay, and then just the last verse that I want us to be aware of. There are many more like this, but just for this evening then, the last verse is Proverbs 18 verse 14. Proverbs 18 verse 14. The spirit of a man will sustain him through sickness, but who can bear a broken spirit? So what I'd like you to do is keep these verses in mind, come back to them in your own time, think about them when you have chance, but we'll focus on the first of the verses that we noticed this evening, and that's Proverbs 12 and verse 25. So let's turn back then to Proverbs 12 and verse 25. Anxiety in the heart causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. Okay, there's our text for this evening. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and put this verse and those other verses into the context of the book of Proverbs as a whole. And I want us to see that in this section of Proverbs, there is one word that sums up what Solomon is doing. And that one word can be understood in three ways, okay? So we'll do that to begin with, and then we'll come down into this verse. Let's ask God's help then as we do so. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can meet tonight and we can have this time of fellowship. We thank you for the day. We thank you for what you've enabled us to do today. We thank you for your goodness to us throughout the day. We thank you for each other. We thank you for being in one another's company this evening. And as we take our time away from other things and we seek to build ourselves up in your word, and we seek to look after ourselves through the wisdom that we find here in Proverbs, we ask our God for your blessing upon us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, then, so this verse, so these verses are in a section of the book of Proverbs that are known as the Proverbs of Solomon. So just take a note then, Proverbs 10 and the first verse, right through to Proverbs 22 and verse 16. Oh, that's the end of the chapter. These are the, it's not actually, I'm sorry, I'm lying. Proverbs 22, verse 16. That's the end of what's known as the Proverbs of Solomon. So this is a distinct section within the book of Proverbs. And what you have are 375, believe it or not, short poems. Each poem is just one verse in our English Old Testament, and each verse consists of 2 lines. And the 2-line structure offers a contrast. So the first line will say one thing, and then the second line will say another. And very often the first line gives the problem, and the second line will give the solution, or the first line to a verse will give the perspective of the human beings. The second line will give us God's view, if you like, or some truth about God. So a whole stretch in this section of short poems attributed to Solomon, and they take the form of Solomon the wise father speaking to a son. Now, we saw that in the first section of Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 4 all the way through to chapter 9. It's the same idea there. It's clearer there. But in this section, we have these very short poems, 2 lines each, and each verse, each poem, if you like, is a contrast. Now, in this section, there's one word that you need to get familiar with in order to make sense of these poems, these wise sayings of Solomon. It's a word I've mentioned to you over the years, so you may remember it, you may not, it doesn't matter, but it's a really crucial word to hold on to when looking at this section of Proverbs. And that word is the word interactionism. Interactionism. Okay, it's Solomon is talking about the interaction between. Okay, so this whole section deals with the theme of interactionism, the interaction between. And I want us to see that Solomon outlines 3 types of interaction. The first one, and for many people, the most interesting interaction that Solomon lays out for us, is the interaction between body and soul. He sees the relationship between soul and body as a crucial relationship. And the condition of the body is often linked to the condition of our soul, or the condition of our heart, or the condition of our mind, or the way we are thinking, or our outlook, or our disposition. So we'll talk about cheerfulness and how cheerfulness brings health benefits. If you're of a cheerful disposition, you're more likely to enjoy physical health. So that's me out. And you've got, that's the sort of interaction that you've got here in this section of Proverbs. And it's interesting because our understanding of physical health today is a physical understanding. So we talk about diseases, and we talk about bacteria, and we talk about the body, and we talk about processes in the body and what goes wrong with the body. So what goes wrong with the heart, or what goes wrong with the skin, or what goes wrong with the immune system. And we talk about the body and we see it as a separate, distinct thing. Now, in Proverbs, as in the Bible as a whole, the body is never understood apart from the soul. The body is always understood in its relationship to your thoughts, to your heart, to your emotions, to your outlook, to the condition of your insides. So Proverbs links inside and outside. And what happens on the inside of a person, so bitterness, or envy, or jealousy, or resentment, or a critical spirit, will lead to physical health problems. Similarly, if on your inside you can look optimistically at life, you can take a positive view of your own life and the lives of others, then there are physical health benefits that are the result of that. So did you notice that in some of those verses that we highlighted earlier? So let me see if I can go back to one of them. Proverbs 17 and verse 22. Do you see the interaction on display here between a person's inner life and their physical life? Do you see it? A merry heart does good like medicine. Imagine your doctor prescribing you 3 doses of a merry heart a day to try and cure some physical problem. But then you get the opposite. Remember, these little poems contain 2 lines that are opposites. Look at the opposite here. A broken spirit dries the bones. So your spirit, your outlook, your inner life, if that's bitter or if that's broken, then there will be physical consequences. So this is the interaction between body and soul that Solomon is wise about. And don't forget, when I say soul, I'm not talking necessarily now about anything spiritual, anything to do with being saved. Soul means your disposition. It means your outlook, your way of viewing things. It means your emotional life. It talks about holding on to things, being, what's the condition of your heart? Are you bitter? That's the sort of thing that criticalness, if you like, that's the kind of thing that is meant here by the inner life. So it's the relationship, the interaction between the inner and the outer, in my experience as a human being. So that's the first form of interaction that Solomon focuses on in these verses. The second kind of interaction is the interaction between people, one person and another. And this interaction is crucial for our well-being. And it's a link back to what we were doing last year, and that's the whole idea of relationships. And for Solomon, relationships are very, very important. And we saw that last year when we looked at Paul's words to Timothy and Titus, the importance of relationships in the church, relationships in the family, relationships in general, how important relationships are. So in this section of Proverbs, we'll have the interactions between human beings. So very often in these poems, there'll be a good one and a bad one. There'll be a lazy man and there'll be an industrial man. There'll be a wicked person and a righteous person. And so you'll have Solomon thinking about the influence people have on each other, how we can have a good influence on each other, we can have a harmful effect on one another. We can do good to each other, we can do harm to one another. We can bring each other down, or we can build each other up. It's the interaction between two people. And if you explore some of the verses, you will see how time and time again, Solomon will talk about one person and then by contrast, another person. You'll talk about the person who is generous, and then you talk about the person who's mean. And the person who's generous will have a great deal, but the mean person who holds on to their possessions and won't share, they end up with nothing. So it's that interaction then between human beings. That's fundamental to this section of Proverbs. So can you see interaction? The interaction within myself, between my body and my soul, the interaction between two human beings. And then the third form of interaction that you have is the interaction between man and God. And this is a really interesting interaction that Solomon thinks about. And he'll say, on the one hand, man, and then he'll say, on the other hand, God. And let me show you one verse where he does this. I may show you another. It depends on how far we go. But the first verse that brings out the interaction between God and man, for tonight's purposes now, is Proverbs 16 and verse 9. So have a look at Proverbs 16 and verse 9. And can you see the interaction on display here? A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his step. So what's the interaction between man and God? Well, we have our ideas, we have our plans, we want to do certain things, but it is God's plans and purposes that will win the day. So there's the interaction between my decision making and God's purposes. God's purposes triumph. Solomon, as a king, is particularly interested in the interaction between a king and God. And there's some verses that you'll see about the fact that the king's heart is in the hands of the Lord. You'll see that, okay? So Proverbs 21 verse 1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of water. He, the Lord, turns it wherever he wishes. So there's that interaction. There's also, to go back to what we said a moment ago, the interaction between kings and men. So interactionism, I hope this is clear, okay? How this idea of the interplay between two things is central to Solomon's wisdom. So 3 types of interaction: mind, body, soul, human beings, kings and people, rich and poor, wicked and good, and so on. And then finally, the interaction between God and men, God and the king. Now, this section is difficult to make sense of if you don't hold in mind this idea of interactionism. And some people have described this section of Proverbs as like listening in to a series of wise men randomly talking about stuff, and the conversation just seems to flow. Well, it is like that, but think about the interaction that's being described in every one of these poems, and identify it and try to make sense of it like that. So there we go. That's the section as a whole. Let's turn then to our verse, Proverbs 12 and verse 25. And you can see straight away it's got 2 parts. Like all these little poems, 2 lines. Sometimes these lines fall neatly into English, other times they don't. But here it falls neatly into English. The first line: anxiety in the heart of man causes depression. And it's a negative statement, as in it's a description of something that you wouldn't want. So we don't want anxiety in the heart, and we don't want depression. And then the second line is where the wisdom is found. And if you like, it's where the answer can be found. But, so you'll often get the word but in these little poems, a contrast. But, says Solomon, a good word makes it glad. So what we've got in this little poem is the interaction between body and soul in the first line. And then in the second line, you have the interaction between 2 people. So the second line, a good word makes it glad, is the interaction between 2 people. The one person is the one who's anxious and depressed. The other person is the one giving the good word. And it's about the interaction between the 2 that you have here in this poem, okay? So let's take each of these lines in turn. Anxiety in the heart causes depression. Now, 2 ideas there. The first is anxiety. And what Solomon means by anxiety is referring specifically to your thoughts. And he's talking specifically about the thoughts we have that are motivated by fear. Fear of. And the fear of isn't specified here, but the Hebrew word means I'm fearing something, and because I'm fearing it, my thoughts are being driven in a certain direction. My thoughts are being fed by my fears. So, for example, we won't talk much about it, but this particular word, anxiety, is used in the Old Testament to describe how some of the tribes felt when they went into the land of Canaan and they had to settle by some of the other nations, by some of the peoples who were already present in the land. So do you remember now, Joshua led them into the land was already occupied, they had to drive out the foreigners, okay? So sometimes an Israelite would settle near to, were they, I can't remember, Canaanites. and they'd be fearful that the Canaanites might do something to them. Now, that's where this word is used, okay? So anxiety means you fear, and because you fear something, then your thoughts are preoccupied with it. So, in the context of the Old Testament, the fear was the fear of the Canaanites, maybe, okay? Now, for us, there's all sorts of fears of that you and I might have. We might have the fear of, fill the blank, you know, fear of failure. We might have the fear of illness. We might have the fear of people disapproving of us. We might have the fear of something terrible happening in the future. Fear of, okay? And because there's that fear there, our thoughts are preoccupied with it. So we think about this thing that we are fearing. We think about it so that we don't sleep. And then we think about it so that we don't focus on what's going on around us. So when we are driving, we are thinking about it. When we are walking, we are thinking about it. When we are maybe watching TV, we are thinking about this thing. It's preoccupied our mind. It's taken over our thoughts. And it's almost as if this fear is controlling, like a rudder on a ship, controlling our thought life. Now, that's what our friend Solomon is describing here, okay? This inner experience, I'm afraid of, I'm fearing something. It's not happened yet. It may never happen. It probably won't happen, but I'm fearing it. And I'm fearing it, and I'm fearing some form of catastrophe. So the catastrophe could be to myself, to my body. The catastrophe could be to somebody I love. So I'm afraid when they take a journey somewhere. Can you get the sense? I'm sure you do. The way this works, okay? There is fear of. Now, what our little friend Solomon does here is he says in this first line of verse 25, fear of, anxiety in the heart, this kind of thinking causes depression. Now, the word depression here means weight. It means heaviness. It's a physical thing. Okay, so there's the interaction between the soul and the body, between the inner life and the physical life. So depression means to be bowed down, to be weighed down. It's like as if you've got a heavy blanket on you, and you're dragging yourself about, and you feel heavy and slow, and it's very difficult to be motivated, and you don't want to get up and do things. You want to sit there. It's that physical feeling that Solomon has in mind. So depression is the English translation. Some of you may have a better translation there, but it's a physical sense of a heavy weight, dragging, crawling along. Okay, your body is heavy. That's what Solomon's describing. So there's the picture, if you like, of the difficulty that sometimes we all experience. Okay, so what you're feeling physically isn't because you haven't eaten or you haven't slept enough, or there's an infection. It's none of those things. It's because of the fear of something that is preoccupying your mind, and it's the effect of that on the body. So that's the problem. What's the solution? So take a look. A good word makes it glad. Now, the word glad is paired in this poem with anxiety. And these little poems often work like that. The first word of the poem is often coupled with the last word in the poem. And the poems then have an idea of a journey. So you start with this and you end with that. And you go through that journey by following the wisdom in the poem. So we start off with these fearings of, we start off with our thoughts that are unhelpful. Our thoughts are troubling us. Our thoughts are distressing us. That leads to me having physical symptoms, but I will end up in a glad place. So glad is another word for your inner life, for your thoughts, for your emotional condition. And gladness simply means health. It means a healthy way of thinking, a helpful way of thinking, a way of thinking that's going to be good for you rather than harmful for you. Okay, so how do we get from one to t'other? Well, take a look at what Solomon says. A good word makes it glad. Good words can help us to find this gladness. Okay, good words help us from that condition of anxiety and depression into a condition of gladness. Good words. So let's be clear, people. Okay, we can be guided, as they say now in these dreadful coronavirus updates. We are guided by the science. Well, we're going to be guided here by the science of what our Bible is telling us. Good words. These are not, word here doesn't refer to preaching. It doesn't refer to Bible study. It's not word like that, you know, the word that we talk about as Christians. Oh, good word this morning, Pastor. It's not like that, okay? This word here means two people, and those two people, the one person is bringing good word to the other person. So it's not religious. It's not in the context of church. It's the personal context of two people. And the one person is bringing good word to the other. Not a word necessarily from the Bible. The word good here means healthy, helpful. So a person is communicating to you, talking with you in a helpful way. And that brings you from anxiety and depression into a place of gladness. So what we're talking about here, guys, is the relationship we can have with each other in which we talk to someone. I would rather say talk with someone in such a way as that helps the person from anxiety to gladness. Okay, it's that's in mind here. So be brave, everybody. Remember, drum roll. This sounds a little bit like therapy, and in fact it does sit within that realm. Okay, so we need to think about this a little bit more, and I want to do it like this. Okay, the anxious and depressed person will remain anxious and depressed, according to this poem, until they're ready to hear good words from someone else. So part of the wisdom of this psalm, proverb, part of the wisdom here is be willing to talk. Be willing to talk with. You keep it all in and bottle it all up. And that's going to be bitterness in the soul that leads to. Remember those verses from chapter 17? There must be. Wisdom requires us to acknowledge and be willing to talk with. Okay? It's foolishness to refuse, to be unwilling to talk with. Okay? Not wanting to talk with can sometimes be a matter of pride. And that will keep you locked in to this experience where you now are. Okay, so the wisdom on display here is being willing, ready, recognize when it would be really good for you to talk with someone. Okay, now all of us have to decide if this is true for us, if this will help us, but the wisdom on offer here is a wisdom encouraging us to willingness to talk with. Okay, now we could discuss this maybe, or maybe not, but my job is to lay out for you what's going on here in this verse. Okay, so the first element of wisdom here is the wisdom to be willing to talk with. And the second element of wisdom here refers to the other person. And the other person must be ready with good words. Okay, now remember, now good here doesn't mean answers. Good doesn't mean here bringing a sermon. The word good here means words that lead to health. So the basic idea of good is health. It's well-being. It's restoring somebody from sickness. So the second person in this poem, the wisdom here is this person needs to be able to communicate in such a way as to bring health to the other. Okay, that's what good word means. Now, isn't there a wonderful richness just there? What is a good word? How do we do it? How do we do good words with each other? Okay, and to me, there's a whole world here waiting to be explored by us if, and this is where the problem often is, if we are willing to explore it. Very often we're not. And that's not an example of wisdom. So wisdom asks the anxious person, the person whose thoughts are troubled, to be willing to talk with. And then this verse offers wisdom to the person who will be talking with you to be ready to talk healthily, to talk helpfully. Okay? Now, of course, what Solomon doesn't do in this verse is tell us what that is and what that looks like. So I think what we need to do here is think about this more broadly, and perhaps to roam about in Proverbs, to roam about in our Bibles, and to think about, well, what does this look like then? So if I want to talk with you, and you are wanting to talk with me, and let's imagine now that, well, we could do it either way, couldn't we? We could imagine that I'm the anxious person who's feeling really physically down. What do I need from you? What do I need from myself? So what I need from myself is a willingness, an openness to talking with you. If I'm going to keep you at that distance, if I'm going to say to you, oh, I'm fine, then I'm not going to get anywhere. And I'm not going to get out of it either, okay? And I don't know how many times over the years I've seen somebody who is perfectly described by this verse, but they freeze you out when you try to draw near to them, to talk with them. You get the doors slammed shut and don't knock sign put on the door, and you just can't get anywhere. Now that's fine, absolutely fine, but that's not the wisdom that we've got here in this verse. Okay, so if I'm anxious and low and physically dragging myself around, I ask myself, am I willing to talk with someone? And you would be wise, says Solomon, if you are willing. Okay, now if on the other hand I'm the person who's going to do the good talk, what does that mean for me? What does it look like to be somebody who wants to go alongside somebody who's anxious and cast down and talk with them. Well, what you've got in this phrase is a goal. You've got a direction of travel. You've got to hold something in mind. So what you're holding in mind, says Solomon, is all that you do, the whole way in which you interact with that person, is to bring them to a place of gladness. Now, that gladness means to help that person come back to a place where their thoughts are more helpful and their mood is more helpful. So you've got somewhere to aim at. You've got somewhere where you need to go. And that's in the direction of helping that person to have a more helpful way of looking at things. Okay, that's your direction of travel. So how do I get there? Now, you know this is wisdom literature, and wisdom literature often wants us just to think about these things, ponder these things. The answer isn't there, but you have to reflect and meditate, and then if you do that, the verse gives up its wisdom to you. Okay? So all I want to do as we finish is offer a couple of guidances, I suppose. What a terrible way of putting it. As to what a good word looks like. Okay, so I'm the person now who wants to come alongside someone who's anxious and depressed, and I want to be able with them to achieve this good word. Okay, to me, the first thing you have to do is be willing to hear what the other person is saying and to help the other person say, to put into words what it is that they're experiencing. And that's crucial because sometimes the person can't put into words what they are thinking and feeling. It's difficult, and there's fear, and sometimes there's the fear to say certain things to somebody else, the fear of being judged, the fear of looking weak, whatever it is. Okay, so to offer a good word is to help a person express to you, to find the words to say to you what it is they're going through. So you're going to listen carefully, and you're going to be encouraging somebody to do that. Can I say to you, what you must always avoid is telling a person what they're feeling. Even if you are doing it because you want to communicate the fact that you understand them. Oh yes, I know what you're feeling. It's this, isn't it? I would say to you, don't do that. Because your job isn't to tell somebody how they feel. Your job is to help them tell you how they feel. And that's a very different thing. And I think all of us get excited when we're talking to somebody, especially if we feel we've understood them. So we want to tell them right away, oh yeah, I know, I get it, I understand. And I understand because how? You are feeling this, aren't you? Okay? So it's about encouraging that person to tell you how they feel, not you telling them how they feel. Right? Does that make sense? So you're going to listen, you're encouraging a person to put what they're thinking and feeling into words. So the whole aim of a good word is to draw out from the person what it is they're going through. And you may remember that this is a technique that Jesus does, that Paul does. It's a technique you see in the ministry of Jesus again and again and again, where he draws out from a person what they already know, what they already think, what they already feel, what they're already going through. Jesus draws it out of them and he says, if this is the case, then that. Okay? And he brings in the next bit as a consequence of what they are already thinking and feeling. That's the definition of a good word. Okay? So do you remember those examples? Jesus, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. Now, we already know that. That's knowledge that everybody has. Consider the birds of the air. Consider the grass of the field. Consider the foxes. Okay? So Jesus starts with asking you to think about something you already know. And then when you can kind of say, oh, yeah, I know the lilies of the field. Yeah, I know the birds of the air. I know the foxes with their holes. Yeah, I know all that. I know that they sell birds for a penny in the market. Yeah, I've experienced that for myself. I've seen it. When Jesus meets you there, he then brings in a new thing, and that new thing builds on what you already know. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor they spin. Yet I say to you, Solomon in all his glory was not dressed like one of these. Now that's a new thing, building on the knowledge you already have. That's what we need to do to each other. That's how we need to help each other. I don't jump in with both feet and tell you stuff. I try to help you express what you already know. So you already know that you're fearful of something. You already know that you're dreading something. You already know that you're convinced of something. You're convinced, that nobody likes you, or you're convinced that you're going to die. You already got that. So a good word is coming alongside you, listening to you, helping you put that into words. And to say, you already know this, don't you? You already feel this. This is what you believe, isn't it? So believing this then, thinking like this, feeling as you do, let's take the next step. And when you take the next step, you're then bringing in something to help that person. You're bringing to them something that they hadn't thought of, or that they hadn't been able to consider for themselves. They hadn't seen it because their thoughts were so taken up with what they were going through. So I'll give you an example. I was recently talking to somebody who felt very bad because this person was given Christmas presents that he thought he didn't deserve. So he's feeling bad about that. He's not working. He wasn't, perhaps, I don't know. I won't give you the full details. So we were talking about, yes, I can, you feel like this. So tell me what that feels like, to feel bad because you've had these Christmas presents. And, helping that person to put that feeling into thought, not saying to him, oh, I know how you feel because I feel guilty too. I wasn't doing that. How is it then that you feel? What's it like to feel like that? Okay, then, so what does feeling like that tell you about yourself? So then you ask the person to think about what it means that they feel guilty. What does it show them about themselves? And what does it show them about their values? And what does it show them about what matters to them? So feeling guilty, say you feel guilty as a parent, feeling guilty about, I don't know, how you've been as a parent maybe. What does it tell you about yourself that you feel guilty? Well, if you think about that for a moment, it tells you that you care for your child. If you didn't care for your child, you wouldn't think about their well-being. You wouldn't think about the effect on their well-being of your actions. You wouldn't worry about that. So feeling guilty is evidence of caring. And what does caring tell you about yourself? Caring tells you that you're the sort of person who values something. You value someone. You wish the best for someone. You want good for someone. So guilt feelings are often a way of recognizing that which is good and helpful about you. You all know people who don't feel guilty about anything. How much do they care about stuff? What are they like when it comes to caring about anything? Well, very often there's very little care. So guilt is often a way of recognizing that it's based in what matters to me. And what matters to me is the well-being of someone else. Oh, I hadn't thought of it like that before. Well, that's a good word. A good word is helping you think about things that you haven't thought about before, but it starts from the place you're already at. So for this chap, it was, oh, I don't feel I deserve these presents. Well, what does that tell you about yourself then? Oh, well, it tells me that, lots of thinking you, lots of further conversation. Oh, well, it tells me that I think, my parents have spent money and that must mean that they care about me. And then that must mean that, and then, oh, right. So because I don't want to take advantage of them, because I don't want to exploit them, because I don't want to misuse them, that's telling me that I've got a good set of values here. So can you see what I'm trying to put very badly into words here? A good word helps a person see something that flows from what they already know. But they might not know that they know it yet, or they may not have been able to see it, to connect to it, because the anxiety has been causing a storm in the minds and the hearts of that individual. So by helping them to talk about where they're at and what it is and how it's going and what they're feeling and what they're fearing, you bring them out to a point where you can bring in a new thought, and that new thought, building on what is already known and experienced by the person, helps them, becomes a good word. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm not actually looking at me, I'm talking a bit more. Does anyone remember what this kind of approach is called in the life of Jesus, in the life of Paul? It's something that they how do I put it? Paul certainly learned it. Anybody remember? You're all muted, mind, so I don't know why I'm asking you really. It's called the Socratic method, okay, from Socrates. When you bring out what somebody knows, and Socrates said, didn't he? I don't know anything. But what he meant by that was his business wasn't to tell you things, but to help you express what's already inside of you and adding to it. Okay, so 2 wisdoms here, guys. The wisdom to be willing to engage with somebody else when you're anxious and depressed and low in mood. A willingness to engage with them around a good word, to be ready to do so, to hear, to listen, to be open and receptive. Okay, it's that kind of wisdom. And then for the other person, it's the wisdom then to be able to talk in such a way as to help somebody, to draw them out. That's what's in view here. Now, millions of things have been left unsaid, haven't they? And that's fine. So, the role of medication, all those sort of things left unsaid. What we are doing here is we are just exploring the wisdom in this one particular poem, okay? Build on it with those other verses that we've looked at. We may come to look at them in turn, or we may look elsewhere in the book of Proverbs for well-being wisdom. But that, I think, is enough for this evening. Okay, thank you.